And so there's a fundamental mismatch between emissions liabilities from corporates and the availability of projects that sequester and avoid
Yeah.
carbon going into the atmosphere. And there always will be. Like we wouldn't, if there wasn't, we wouldn't have climate change, right? That fundamental imbalance exists, like is why we have climate change. And so long as that remains a problem of this magnitude, you will have that fundamental imbalance as so long as these markets are functioning and they're starting to function better again. And so you're seeing the market reality reflects sort of the physical reality, which is like it's very hard to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And so if you want supply, you have to get in now. And to be fair to Microsoft too, like a lot of people say like, well, we're not Microsoft, we're not Microsoft. The vast majority of Microsoft deals are offtake agreements that the contract details aren't out for a lot of them, but I suspect a lot of them are pay on delivery. And so, like, yes, you don't have their due diligence team, but like you can go to Valaterra, you can go like there's a whole host of people who can help you structure these deals where you don't have to invest off balance sheet. And there are banks and intermediaries that if you've got a signed offtake, are going to be able to put up financing capital that'll unlock huge amounts of supply. And like that's a huge piece of it. And that's why Microsoft and Symbiosis exists, is to catalyze this and say, hey, come on in. The water's
Yeah.
fine. More people should be doing this.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, alongside weekly bestie Renee Velasquez. And today we have on two fantastic guests, Thibault Sorret, co-founder and CEO of Ecosystem Restoration Standard, and Judith Simon, COO of Ecosystem Restoration Standard and former president and interim CEO of Vera. And, I want to say thank you to our guests for joining today. It's a pleasure to have you. And today we're going to be talking a bit about, what was that?
I was just saying, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, of course. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. And, today we're going to be talking a bit about nature-based solutions, the standards, what's been holding them back, and how ERS is working to flip the script. So I think, to start off, the carbon market has evolved quite fast, but nature-based solutions have often been underserved. So I want to go back to how this all started, right? And ask you what inspired the creation of ERS. Was there a particular pain point in the market that you were responding to? And why do you think the market needs a new standard in the first place?
It's a great question. I think it might be useful to talk about the origin story of ERS and go back all the way to 2017. I was living in Latin America at the time in Argentina, and I got to see some beautiful places. I got to go to Patagonia. I ended up traveling to Ecuador, to the Galapagos. And it struck me how few truly wild places I had been to, despite traveling the world throughout my life, relative to something like the Galapagos that were left. And I started becoming fascinated by biodiversity and biodiversity loss as a problem to tackle. And a couple months later, I was with my family in Panama, and I was reading a book by an eminent biologist called E.O. Wilson, who invented a field called island biogeography, which effectively looks at the relationships between the spaces of the wild that we have left and the number of species they can hold. And the basic conclusion is that we live in landscapes that are increasingly fragmented, and we're on track to lose about 80% of the world's biodiversity in the next couple of centuries if we keep going down this track. And reading that book while driving through Panama in particular really struck me because you would go from these very lush, vibrant forests and then through degraded pasture lands and see that contrast, see these islands of what was left and what could be with degraded landscapes in contrast. And it was then that I decided I want to commit the rest of my career to solving this crisis or helping solve this crisis. And so I took on a master's in biodiversity alongside my full-time role. And a couple of years later, sold my shares. I had 42,000 euros to my name, put all of that into building a company, which might not be the soundest financial thing to do, but I was all in. And so started building a team. And 4 years in, we're now 35 people and building a standard. And the reason why we chose to build a standard is we looked at the carbon markets and market-based mechanisms in general as a fantastic way to drive finance to restoration and conservation projects. But we noted that the speed and scale at which it was currently happening wasn't fit for purpose. We need to increase speed and scale as levers if we want this to be a solution that tackles tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of hectares, not just several million, several tens of million at the most.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. And you know, like in my last question, when I asked why does the market need a new standard in the first place,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of people have, you know, they look at the market and they get confused. There's lots of different, registries and standards. It's quite fragmented in a lot of different places. There's people, voting for one main standard and methodology. Then there's other people. There's a lot of competition. So I'd love, maybe you could touch on that question of, why does the market need a new standard, and what makes ERS fundamentally different from existing standards, right? Especially for reforestation projects, nature-based projects.
Yeah, it's a great question. We've gotten it in the past. The first thing I want to recognize is that we're building on the shoulders of giants. So there's been standards, legacy standards that have been here for a while and that have built an existing ecosystem. And for the first 15 years, a lot of those standards were really fit for purpose and at a time where the market was a little bit smaller. And now we're entering a new phase for the carbon market that hopefully is the phase that gets it ready for scale. And the readiness for scale piece is something that we've really, really focused on. So we're able to certify projects much more efficiently, much faster, and to, I would say, even more rigorous standards than the existing cohort of registries, in large part because we spent the last 4 years investing in digitizing how a standard works. So we're the only standard that centralizes carbon calculations for every single project at the standard level using geospatial tools. That's massive in terms of increasing consistency of how the assessments are done, but also the speed at which we can operate. Same thing, a lot of standards are talking about digitization. We've been digitized day one, right? There's no 200-page PDFs that project developers has to submit to us. Everything is field-based. So speed and scalability is a really, really key component of what we do. And the second component of why we're different and I think why we're needed in the market, you see these three things you've got. For those who are audio only, you won't be able to see this, but you've got three pillars: ecological recovery, carbon, and livelihoods. And we really believe that the co-benefits approach is insufficient for nature-based projects. We really think that a three pillars approach, a core benefits approach, is absolutely necessary. And the reason is that you can't dissociate the permanence of a project from the buy-in of local stakeholders and communities. They're inseparable. If a community does not want the project there in the long term, then the permanence is at risk. And so all of these things, if the ecology of the site wasn't carefully thought through, the climate change will significantly disrupt the project in the next 20, 30 years, or it increases the chances that it does. And so this approach of co-benefits as optional add-ons, we believe is insufficient. So we've really driven hard on making those an integral part of what we do and pushing the bar, raising the bar on a lot of these things to make them mandatory requirements. So
Yeah.
speed, scale, and a holistic focus on things that we believe matter a lot is why we came into this space. And just last bit to answer your question perhaps more precisely, today ARR is like 3 to 5% of the carbon markets, depending on how you slice it. There's tremendous demand for high quality reforestation projects of the type that we certify. And those projects need to come to market faster and at scale. That 3% needs to scale massively. And so why are we here? Because we believe that we can bring that part of the market, we can grow that part of the market better than the players that have been here in the past. Or at
Yeah.
least we hope so.
Yeah, speed and scale. That's something that I think, I've heard a million times over the past 6 months at all of these carbon conferences. And but looking to our other guests, Renee, it looks like you're itching to jump in here on this
Um,
topic. You know,
yeah, no, thanks, Eddie. And thank you, Thibault and Judith, for joining. And I'm really excited that we're having this conversation, but really great to see you guys highlighting this very topic and just some etymology, right? So speed and scale, I think, was popularized really by John Doerr's book, right? Really sort of focusing on how climate action can actually deliver on its promise, right? Like, how can we cut global greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050? And effectively it creates this roadmap of these 6 big objectives in order to achieve those goals, electrification, decarbonization of the grid, food systems, protect nature, clean up industry, and then remove carbon. If we're looking at the protect nature and the remove carbon bit, like Thibault said, it's ARR is really critical. It's always obviously unplanned deforestation and red plus, right? But looking at what you said around speed and scale, I think, look, here's my perspective, is that the legacy standards on which you said, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. Absolutely, we need to recognize the hard work that they did in the last 15 or so plus years. It's been instrumental, but they were built in a different era. They weren't built for scale. They weren't built for speed. And I think that what ERS is reflective of is that innovation just isn't an option. It's essential, and we can't just wait for legacy systems and entrenched sort of standards like Vera and others, Gold Standard in particular, to come to mind, which were built in a different era and who are overly bureaucratic and process driven if we're going to achieve the desired outcome, which is scale, right? And so we need to rethink from a systems architecture, from start to finish, right? How these new standards can actually operate. And you touched on it, right? Thibault, you said about effectively digital PDDs. It's a completely novel approach to take and essentially ingesting data from the field, as opposed to a creative writing exercise, 100-page PDD that are all heterogeneous, no homogeneity there. Everything is different. Everything is bespoke. And that bespoke approach just doesn't translate to speed and scale, nor does it translate from a market's perspective to enable investors to compare projects side by side, right? Because you're comparing a cantaloupe to an orange one day and then a mango and then a banana the other day. It doesn't translate because they're all very, very unique. And so in this context, I think what you guys are doing is great. And, the final thing I'll say is, your methodology is very well respected. And obviously, I think we'll talk about that later on with external third-party assessments, but also you're building out a really tremendous pipeline that is supported not just by the project developers, but very interestingly, by the corporate buyers, right? And then the secondary market participants are likely to follow. So I'm keen to see what you guys have in store, and I'm really excited to have this chat.
yeah.
Me too. Thanks, Renee.
Yeah, Renee, thanks for jumping in there. Before we move on to the next section, Judith, did you want to jump in here as well, or should we move on to the next section where I think you'll be able to add a lot of color?
Okay, why don't we wait for that? I'm ready and willing to jump in at any moment because I wanted to reemphasize some of the things that Renee said, but I'll hold my thought for just a second.
Okay. No, sounds good. And I wanted you know, to
Just
frame
chime
this.
in anytime, Judith.
Yeah, anytime, anytime.
I also like seeing Eddie on his toes. It's actually quite fun. Sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. Yeah, well. All right. Well, obviously, moving into the present, we talked a bit about the past, moving into this new chapter, this new leadership, right? ERS stepping into a new phase, expanded momentum. What does that look like today? And specifically for Judith, what drew you to ERS at this moment in your journey, in its journey? Um, would love for you to provide some color on that and maybe touch on your past and the present moment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and thank you again for having us on. I didn't get to say thank you early in the podcast. I think what you've heard already is really compelling. So what drew me to the role was I met Thibault. And so a clear, compelling, action-oriented, optimistic, innovative approach. And going back to what Renee said, in my role at Vera, I had the opportunity to meet with hundreds of leaders in the carbon market to understand what they needed from the standards body and how do we enable that market. And so how do we enable speed and scale and trust and transparency? And the closer I got to what was happening at ERS, the more I understood how they are solving problems that the market really needs. And so the digitalized process from the beginning built with the project developer in mind. So it's not just the platform and the tools that are digitalized. There's a web app to collect the data, and that's connected to the certification process so that everything is like built end to end. And we won't stop there. We're going to continue to innovate and make the tools simpler and accessible. And what that means is that we're enabling more great action to happen around the planet. So that's what drew me into the role. And I think the last thing is we're at this moment, all this work's been done to build this infrastructure and to build trust and the robust safeguards and all of that. And now we're ready. And so it's exciting to see this potential that we have for growth and scale, not just in volume and ARR, but also adding other methodologies and increasing our impact that we can have. So that's what drew me in.
Yeah, certainly. Well, that's great to hear. And I think I definitely want to touch on yesterday's announcement, which showed a growing wave of support from market actors, right, in endorsing ERS. I think that's a pretty big deal, right? And for context, yesterday, a diverse coalition of market stakeholders have publicly endorsed ERS as a key innovator in carbon certification. And it highlights that the market is ready for change, right? Because better solutions are urgently needed. You have long certification timelines, high costs, and barriers to innovation, which have hindered the scaling of high quality nature-based projects. And this comes at a time, in the wake of a political mess with emissions continuing to rise. The world has breached 1.5 degrees Celsius for the first time last year. So it's clear that, like you said before, speed and scale, this market needs to evolve at a much faster pace if it's to reverse any of the major negative impacts that we're going to see in the next few decades. So would love to touch on that endorsement. What does that endorsement signal about where the market is heading? And how do you keep the momentum going beyond that initial coalition, right?
I think it actually answers the first question, one of the first questions you asked, which was, why is there a need for another standard? And the reality is that we're in a free market. Competition drives innovation, and for a long time we were in an oligopolistic setup. because you have these network effects that get created whereby buyers are used to one standard, and so they request one or two standards, and then so the suppliers then all follow, and that creates sort of a natural oligopoly. What's happened with ICVCM especially is it's leveled the playing field in a very real way. It said, well, let's look at which methodologies, not just the programs, let's look at the programs and the methodologies that meet a bar that's higher than it's been before, and let's see who meets it. And if the credit is labeled to CCP, it meets ICVCM standards, that's really opened it up for the buyers to say, actually, that's what we want. It doesn't have to be this standard or that standard. It has to be to that quality. And once you start opening that door, you open the door to competition, and then it becomes about what markets like, which is, can you do it better? Can you do it faster? Can you do it more efficiently? And that's what drives this industry forward. And I think part of why we're going to see so much more progress in the next 5 years than we have, I think, in recent memory, is because that competition is coming in. I mean, we were called out in the LinkedIn post by one of the larger registries a couple months ago. Judith, we talked about it, saying like, "Oh, we're catching up to the new kids." I mean, the fact that we're growing standard, but like the existing players are taking note, and it's forcing them to catch up too, and to play that game and to accelerate their development as well. And so at the end of the day, we're in this for the mission, right? The projects like this one are in Benegas in Costa Rica, our first pilot project, are the reason we do this. Winning is more money going to the ground for restoration and conservation. And so as long as we can help raise the bar everywhere, then I think we're playing our role and we're doing a good job. And that announcement is an example of that. It's one of many coming examples. We're going to have a series of these in the next few weeks that are demonstrating, hey, the market's ready for innovation, the market's ready for a new approach, and ERS is doing a good job at capturing the attention of players who are looking for a change, who are looking for something new.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And one of those market players that signed that the endorsement was Valaterra, right? And I think
it's true. Yeah.
I think pulling you in here, what are your thoughts on the market endorsement signal from the stakeholders? And that's something that we've signed and we're actively pushing for a long time, is innovation and speed and scale. Would love to hear your
address to me, Eddie?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna pull you in here and put you on.
I'm happy to. No, but you're happy to be put on the spot. Like, effectively, firstly, we're really proud to stand alongside, 50 plus other carbon market leaders and endorsing ERS really as effectively this next generation certification framework for high integrity nature-based carbon projects. And to piggyback on what Thibault just said, right, the VCM is evolving. And what this new level playing field that the ICVCM has essentially created, I like this notion of it's a higher bar, but it allows for new entrants to come in to effectively disrupt and agitate through innovation, which can only be beneficial for the market, right? Innovation historically always benefits the consumer. And what it does is it challenges the oligopolistic kind of approach and erodes bureaucracy. And if it can actually help to create more choice and optionality for corporate buyers, great, right? If it can create a different pipeline that can run parallel to or synergistically with the other standards to create greater output, so hence achieving greater scale, great. If it can actually help to challenge existing standards to revise or rethink their approaches around specifically digital monitoring, reporting, and verification, then great. And as a result of that, they're going to sort of chew up some of that market share. But systems don't stay in stasis, and markets are reflective of that. So I don't expect Vera and Gold Standard to kind of just sit back and go, oh no, we're going to lose market share. They're going to react in a positive way. And I think that's great. And we should be encouraging a competition, right? I think back and harken back to, my time at Expansive, we had for a long time effectively been beating this drum around the need for greater transparency, the ability to effectively mitigate counterparty and credit risk through trading on screen and price discovery, all these other benefits. And in the early days when there was insufficient liquidity, it was a very hard sell to a lot of the market participants. But then we kind of overcame like a tipping point, and then it started to accelerate. But very quickly, we started to see more competitors coming into the market. And I remember having a conversation, I think I mentioned this in our first episode, Eddie, right, with Mikkel over at CIX. And I called him and I said, hey, welcome to the playground. Like, it's great to see that there's competition here. Now, in between the lines, we're going to compete against one another, but let's also collaborate to make this market better. And I think that, again, coming back to why we signed it, both at Valaterra and Carbon Disclosure Project, is because we want to see greater innovation. We want to see this market move forward in terms of new optionality and greater scale. So again, kudos to Thibault and Judith and their teams on what they're bringing to the market. And obviously, we're really excited to see what that pipeline looks like, and we start to see more and more development of new projects and finance go into those projects, and then corporate buyers actually coming on the offtake side and supporting that liquidity. So we start to see more and more and more investment and protection and conservation of nature. So just some thoughts.
Yeah, sure.
I just want to jump in really quickly too. I think the other exciting part is there's innovation happening through other parts of the market too, and not just in the standard bodies. So the capabilities that we can kind of leverage with new ideas with insurance, or whether it's remote sensing or the data capture or LiDAR or whatever, it's like, how do we as a collective just take it to a whole new level? And so excited to be part of that kind of innovative community, because I do think that raises the bar for all of us, and we have to do this together. It's going to take all of us together urgently. So I think it's exciting to see lots of breakthroughs and lots of press releases coming out.
And Renee, just a balance of what you were saying and what Judith just mentioned too, is the interplay of new technologies coming out, what that enables for standards and other market participants, but then the ability to compete while making it a positive sum game, because at the end of the day, we're all fighting for the same goal, not for arbitrary market share that will result in bottom line dollars. And that's what we're focused on. We're focused on achieving a mission, a collective mission. And so VM47 just released an update. Like, I went out and congratulated Spencer Plum right away, because I know he put a ton of work into that. And we're really happy to see them evolve, and like you can see some of the rules are inspired by some of the work we've done. And just like some of the dynamic baselines in our first version, that was an idea that they really took and ran with. And so you can see these things building off each other. And I think that's really healthy for an ecosystem to have that. And that's a sign of, I think, healthy competition making its way into the marketplace.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. And I have to applaud everyone as well. But yeah, so moving on to more of the nitty-gritty methodology aspects, touching on some recent market developments and news stories. I read this article recently from Carbon Pulse. So a recent review by ratings agency Renoster praised ERS's new ARR methodology, M001, for its ecological rigor, especially the requirement that projects identify a pre-referenced native ecosystem to restore and hire local ecologists to inform project design and long-term restoration success. This is celebrated as a major step forward for ecological integrity and place-based restoration. And before I dive into some of the concerns that they might have had, I do want to ask, like, what made you implement these aspects into the methodology, like identifying a pre-referenced native ecosystem? Yeah. Like, could you touch on that for maybe our audience and maybe myself included that may not fully understand these aspects of these scientifically rigorous methodologies?
Yeah, so let's dive right in. Our first methodology is an ecosystem restoration methodology. So what that looks at terrestrial forests in particular. So right now in the carbon market speak, that would be ARR. But you can have many types of ARR. You can plant monocultures of eucalyptus and call that ARR. And it's going to be a very different project than ecosystem restoration, right? And so to be very clear, we only certify a subset of ARR projects that are native species based. And the science of ecological restoration is a science that's been evolving now for several decades and has best practices. And so if you look at the Society for Ecological Restoration, which is the leading body and standard setter for ecosystem restoration in particular in the general field, they'll always recommend using a reference site. And so what a reference site is, so right behind me, there's a project that we certified in Costa Rica. This is the Corcovado National Park. It covers 0.1% of the world's surface area and holds 5% of its biodiversity. It's insane. It's a wonderful place. That forest is a really good way to inform this finca, this farm that was heavily degraded. And so the goal is going to be, how do you get this farm to look like the forest in the background? And the reality is you're going to start with the end state in mind, and then you are going to work back from there. You're probably not going to get all of the species that are in the mature forest. So you're going to start with planting pioneer species that grow really fast and put sort of a first canopy in place. And then you're going to plant a second set of species and the third. And then over time, over 30, 40 years, you're going to have a forest that begins to resemble a mature restored ecosystem. And it's a very different way to build a project than to say, I'm going to plant acacia, eucalyptus, and pine because they're fast growing species and I'm going to get a lot of credits. You end up with very different projects when you start with the end in mind. And so that's something that is really, really essential. And again, ERS has 3 pillars: ecological recovery, carbon, and livelihoods. That's a really good example of the work that we've done on the ecological recovery pillar to push the bar on what quality looks like on the carbon markets.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for touching on that. And I think moving into the other side of the story, which is a review of flagged concerns around the carbon accounting methodology, particularly the reference on the reliance on third-party carbon stock maps. Like shout out to like Chloris Geospatial; those guys are doing great work over there. That use satellite imagery. Renoster warned that these models may overgeneralize carbon estimates, especially in small, young forests. They might underestimate uncertainty in satellite data and overissue credits in early years. Though ERS, you guys noted that this evens out over time. Would love for you to touch on some of those critiques or flagged concerns from Renoster, the ratings agency.
So 2 things. One, the Renoster team's absolutely right. And we actually flag all of this stuff as limitations in our limitation sections. I think we're the only standard on the market that has a limitation section because a lot of this is really, really hard pioneering work. And you're going to have limitations regardless of the approach you take. And so the question is, what trade-offs are you making and why? If you take sort of traditional DBH height as the way you're going to be doing carbon calculations, for example, embedded in that, you're going to have massive uncertainties around allometric equations. So the relationship between the base of the tree, the circumference of the tree, and the amount of biomass in that tree, especially in sort of global south countries where we have a lot less data, you have massive uncertainties for that. And so it's not necessarily about whether or not there are uncertainties or limitations to a a methodology that assesses carbon in trees or estimates how much carbon there are in a tree. It's what trade-offs are you making? And so the trade-offs we decided to make was to have an approach that was incredibly consistent, that's programmatic. You can't game it, because we are the ones running in a standardized manner how the carbon calculations get done based on satellite data. So what we do is we look at a project area. We use satellite imagery to understand how much biomass there is in those early years at year 0. And then we look at how much growth there is over time on that project area relative to thousands of control plots that we match to based on how similar they are historically to the project site. And then we look at the delta, the difference in performance between the project area and thousands of control plots around the project area to see how the project is performing relative to a cohort of control plots. And because we're using the same data on the control plots and on the project area, we're able to get an incredibly consistent approach that a project developer can't game. If you contrast it with how carbon calculations are done right now under most standards, the project developer decides what AGB calculation methodology they're going to use. They get to do their own measurements. They get to set their own sample plots. And so the amounts of, they get to set their own control plot sites. They get to decide what stocking index, so how the biomass on those control sites gets measured. And it doesn't have to be the same as how they measure biomass on their project area. If you start to look at the number of places in which a project developer, if ill-intentioned, can introduce bias, it's absolutely enormous. And so we felt that centralizing that calculation piece at the standard level is not only huge for speed and scale, but also for robustness of the system as a whole. And the good news is that the limitations that Elias pointed out are rapidly going away. And I'll note two things. There was a satellite that went into space a couple weeks ago now from the European Space Agency, the biomass satellite, that is specifically built to improve the world's satellite-based carbon estimations. And so we're months away from having drastically better spaceborne measurements than we already have. And in the way that we issue credits, we actually recalculate all of the history of crediting from baseline to the present day every time we redo the calculations. So we get to benefit from all of these improvements in technology over time and bake them into the calculation. So that's number one. Number two, in the next version of our methodology, we're already thinking about how do we calibrate to a LiDAR on the ground. And so LiDAR, for those who don't know, is a technology that sends out thousands of light points per square meter and creates these 3D maps of an environment. And so you can use that to calibrate the satellite imagery and get even more accurate results. And so those two things, the improvement in satellite-based data over time and our ability to calibrate in the next version, is massively addressing a lot of these potential concerns. And overall, the trade-offs that we're making by centralizing the carbon calculations at the standard level are very well worth it.
And I just want to jump in and say that I don't know for the listeners if you could tell how many innovative breakthrough things are in just this one stream. It's huge. So solving a conflict of interest issue with project developers doing their own carbon calculations, check, this is centralized and standardized and consistent with the data sets. And then number two is when the data sets get better, poof, everybody benefits. So all of a sudden, every project and every calculation from then on will be across the universe. It won't be that every project developer has to adopt and figure that out on their own. It will be built into the calculations. So talk about transparency, consistency, trust, like super, super exciting. So Thibault, I just had to reiterate that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for jumping in, definitely. And Renee, it looks like you're itching to jump in as well.
I am. And so, it's fantastic to see this level of innovation. You guys have described it, but I'd like to zoom back out and kind of provide this 30,000-foot view around markets. And it comes to a word that you just said, Judith, which is about trust. And what happened, in 2020, we saw this perfect confluence of financial markets and civil society essentially realized that we have this existential threat and we need to devote energy resources and time to solving these problems. And we saw the ascension of carbon markets in that time. But then in late 22 and 23 and 24, we've seen essentially an erosion of that trust based on effectively things that you've just highlighted, right? Around effectively overcrediting risk, right? And conflicts of interest. And what is great, and obviously it's with the benefit of hindsight, you guys coming in as new kids on the block, you're effectively listening to the criticisms that are existing in the market or from folks in and out or inside or even outside of the market that are criticizing the VCM. And you're taking them head on and you're actually realizing that you can actually improve. And it starts with the very first thing that you said, Thibault, which is an acknowledgement of the imperfect nature of the systems and an iterative approach on improving the system over time. And I think that that's just analogous to the way that the rest of the real world works and like pragmatic kind of system architecture works, especially in technology, right? You look at artificial intelligence, we're undergoing the fastest transformation from a technology from nascency to, general intelligence, I think, in the next 2 to 5 years or less. And we see this exponential growth in the potential, but it's iterative, right? It starts with server racks. It starts with, all of the energy that goes into it. Then it's the systems and the LLMs, and it's this honesty around like, this is the North Star. We're trying to get there. And there are peaks and troughs in there. And I think the carbon markets has been trying to purport this kind of, angelic view of everything's perfect, and it's not. And it's iterative. We're building on system architecture. And so you got like version 1, then version 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and continue to build it. And I think it's really great. And that goes to the heart of innovation. Innovation is continuously dissatisfied with complacency and stasis. And it's just always trying to get ahead, right? And improve. Why? Because we just want to get better and better and better and better and better over time. And so I think that's great. And I think what you guys are doing is symbolic of all of that. And apologies for the background noise. I'm at the airport and my flight's boarding soon. So
all good. And I appreciate you taking time while traveling. But just to bounce off what you just said, it drives me nuts that the carbon markets take this approach. And I think that one of the words that you use is perfection, imperfection. You don't go to a bank and say, which of your financial products are perfect, right? That'd be absolutely ludicrous. You're like, what are the risks and uncertainties inherent in this asset class?
Risk.
And like everything else in the world is measured as uncertainty and risk. And what you want to do is you want to put right on the box, here are the risks, here are the uncertainties. Are you willing to engage in this transaction? And if you are, then let's operate within those bounds. And so it's our job as a standard to make it really explicit. What do we know? What do we not know? And then yes, to be conservative where we can't be accurate. First, try to be accurate. If you can't be accurate, then be conservative. And so like how we invented this entirely new way to address uncertainty, to try to address it better. It was shout out to Nan Pond from Rubicon Carbon. They had a huge announcement this week, but she was the one in our public consultation process who really pushed us hard to think about new ways of even measuring uncertainty. And we came up with an entirely new approach. We're using Monte Carlo simulations. We're not going to get too technical for this call, but how do you quantify the uncertainties and expose them to the market in such a way that they can make rational decisions? Not like, is it perfect? Is it not perfect? It's a completely different conversation, and we need to shift the conversation.
But I love that. I love that approach because it actually it first acknowledges the reality on the ground, and then secondly, it actually allows for markets to adequately price that risk.
That's it,
right? And now the markets can help to achieve the scale by sending the relevant price signals. Okay. I, as an investor, am very risk averse. I'm going to go for the highest level of conservatism, et cetera, et cetera. But therefore, I'm obviously propose to pay the highest possible price. Conversely, if there's higher risk, then I want a discount relative to. And we see that in every single other asset class. And so this is really a healthy, like a realistic sort of revisitation of what the carbon markets are. And I think that actually is a really solid foundation to enable that speed and that scale to emerge. So really straight.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to switch gears, Eddie, to something else, but like a very niche example of how that works, and even on a micro scale within our standards, we're going to allow in the next version of our methodology for project developers to calibrate. So the way it works is we don't actually credit on in the middle, in the 50th percentile. We credit a little bit conservatively based on the uncertainty that we attribute to a project. And what a project will do is, by calibrating, they're going to reduce the uncertainty on their project, and that'll increase, in most cases, how many credits they get. And so, Renee, what you were saying there is like, as a project developer, you can make that choice too. I'm going to invest in technology like LiDAR calibrations to decrease certainty on to decrease uncertainty on my project, to increase certainty, and I'm going to get a financial benefit out of that. I'm going to result in having more credits that I can bring to the market, and that's exactly those trade-offs that we want to try and to introduce to the market, so that people can make these decisions.
Yeah, certainly. And I didn't want to move on too quickly, because I think you touched on, a really significant, pain point for the voluntary carbon market, and it's this perfection paradox, right? And with all other projects in all other industries, based on these risk and return probabilities, investors will put billions of dollars into harmful projects and businesses every day. So, you have forest logging, mining, oil extraction, and nobody expects perfection, right? You get rewards if you're willing to take these risks, right? That's the point of putting your capital to work. But paradoxically, when it comes to doing good, such as investments in climate mitigation, and the principle of getting rewarded for taking risks doesn't seem to apply as much in this market, right? And like in all other investments, carbon projects come with some shortcomings and some imperfections that I think some people have denied to defend in the past, or just straight up don't recognize, and I think that hurts the market. And some work out well and some fail, but often failures are not viewed as learning opportunities in this market, but they're viewed as evidence that the carbon credit system is fundamentally flawed somehow. And in short, imperfections are fully accepted in projects that destroy the planet. But when it comes to carbon emission reduction projects, perfection appears to be expected, right? And that double standard makes carbon projects disproportionately vulnerable, and hence this paradox of particularly risky investments, right? And I think that's a really key aspect that you touched on, and I just wanted to share. Shout out to Renat and Steve Schwick from the Carbon Paradox.
Paradox number 9, I believe, if I'm recalling that correctly.
I love how you're weaving it into every episode, Eddie. No, it's super great work. And it's fantastic to reflect it, because like Steve said, and Renat said, once you see the paradoxes, you're like, man, you see it in every day. And it's fantastic. It's kind of like having a manual, right? And now you go, oh, okay, cool. Well, here's how we got to resolve it. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, certainly. I mean,
really thought they did there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it just came direct. It flows directly right into what you were talking about in the real world, day to day, action that you guys are.
It's also just, if I may, it's not an excuse not to do anything. Because I think one of the traps is, oh, it's imperfect, and now we say these things are imperfect. These are our limitations. Great. Let's just sit back on our laurels and say you have to accept the uncertainty. And it doesn't have to be that way. Renee, back to what you were saying, this iterative process is you state your limitations, but I think that section in our standard is called limitations and future improvements. And I think both parts are really key, is just state the limitations, put it on the front of the box, and then go hustle and figure out new ways to solve these things and to make them better.
Yeah, certainly. And now I just noticed you guys all have,
I changed my background.
That's it. I like that. Where is that, Renee?
I'm now
That's the Daintree rainforest in Australia.
Wow.
You actually took
It
that
was
photo.
fun. I took that photo a long, long time ago. Yeah, I was flying over and little prop plane, and I took that photo.
Is
Just
it
inspired by your background. It's
is
not a
it
carbon project. It's just beautiful nature.
Oh no, but I remember as a kid going to Australia and seeing these like tiny tree kangaroos and just my mind being absolutely
The
blown.
little
It was,
wallabies.
yeah,
Yeah,
little wallabies like
there's rock wallabies and little kangaroos. Yeah.
in these forests. Incredible.
Australia's an interesting place, guys.
It's such an interesting place.
Australia, yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
sorry, back on track, Eddie.
back on
Apologies.
track. Moving on to, I think, one of the more significant stories from this week. As you know, this podcast is called This Week in Carbon, so we got to touch on some of the biggest stories. So, global tech giant Microsoft and California headquartered Rubicon Carbon, which is a carbon solution provider, has struck a deal for 18 million afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation credits, according to Press Thursday, right? And there we go. There's the link that Thibault sent. Rubicon Carbon, it said it entered into a framework agreement with Microsoft to facilitate the purchase of these CDR credits. And this agreement is one of the largest single buyer commitments of its kind in the world. So that's a pretty big milestone for the industry, for the market. Shout out to both parties there. Each transaction under the deal will be structured as 15 to 20-year offtakes, supporting a pipeline of different individual ARR projects worldwide. And this does demonstrate the growing role of corporate buyers in facilitating private investment for carbon projects that otherwise might lack funding. And this, we could talk about, I feel like, the different aspects about this story, from corporate buyers and private and risk capital to these long-term offtakes in the CDR market for hours. But we'd have to do another episode on that. But just wanted to touch on this story and hear your guys' thoughts. Would love to hear your take if anyone wants to jump in first.
Can I go first? Because my flight's going to board soon, and then you guys
Go
can
for it.
final words. Well, it's again, just congratulations to the team at Microsoft. I think that they do such a great job, and look, they're fairly unique, right? Given the size and scale of their team and their internal capacity to actually evaluate projects, and assess which ones they want to invest in. Eddie, I'm thinking back to a conversation that we had, was it last week or the week before, with Stephanie Zhu, right? So who's now at Yum Brands and food solutions at Delta. That Microsoft approach is an exception to the rule, right? Most corporates lack that kind of internal expertise. So kudos to them, and the fact that they've got it is just a bountiful riches. It's great. But they're actually doing the actual work, and they're continuously funding and investing in these projects, which is so commendable, right? We need to see corporates really step up to the plate and support nature restoration and ecosystem restoration at scale. And we're seeing that. And I think to Thibault's earlier point is there is latent and also existing significant demand for high integrity nature-based removals. And I think we're just starting to see that beginning. And, so that's great. And I hope we see more and more and more emerge. And I hope we see a sort of distribution of the concentration risk, that it's not just Microsoft coming out with the press release all the time, or a Google like on biochar, that we start to see participation that's more broad outside of the tech sector. And so I do think that we'll see that. And so stay tuned. We're working on some interesting things out of the Asian context on that front. But yeah, it's great. And I hope it's just more to come. So yeah, I have one question, Thibault. I'm not sure if you're able to discuss, but how much of that 18 million is coming out of your pipeline?
I think so. The Rubicon team's been really, really great. They've reviewed every version of our methodology from the start and given a lot of feedback. I think they're one of the signatories, actually, one of the 50 signatories, 50 plus signatories that signed the letter of support. And so they're really exciting to have additional pipeline coming out. I mean, we're bringing projects from project developers that have never had access to the carbon markets. One that's out for public comment right now, or that might just have finished public comment, are the descendants of the Inca people in Peru, Pachayari, they're restoring forests in areas that were thought by sort of Western ecologists to not be restorable. And they said, no, like we have reference areas, we have reference forests, like we're going to figure it out, and they did. And you've got this sort of these pockets of projects that currently don't have market access that are coming online, and then you've got these massive assisted natural regeneration projects that are also signing up to ERS, and so the folks at Rubicon seem to be excited to get a good chunk of that pipeline from us, I believe, and as are sort of increasingly more and more buyers. We're part of the standards accepted for symbiosis, for example, and so there's getting broader market acceptance. But Renee, back to what you were saying, what this also tells you, and it's a big announcement for a couple reasons, but one is even with an 18 plus person team, Microsoft is looking to players like Rubicon to say, hey, help us source additional projects that are even outside the scope of our team to go out and do. Like if you can get even more, like we'd love to have more of them. And so it's kind of this moment where you realize even the players that have all of the resources to do the due diligence in-house are also sourcing outside. And it's a sign that we're entering a bit of a supply crunch on the nature-based credit side of things. And I think Patch and Silvera both had reports out that we're starting to see retirements outpace issuances in certain project categories, including ARR. And that pressure, that pressure is going to pull a demand pull for more supply to come in. And I think that's an excellent thing to grow that category. Eddie, I think we had Renee's flight.
Yeah, looks like
I'll just jump in.
I'm still here. I'm just putting away my laptop.
Okay.
I'll switch to the mobile in a second. You guys keep going.
Yeah, I think it's encouraging because when the market stagnated, it was like, when are we going to get demand back? When is there going to be a signal? And it's exciting to see these massive releases and commitments that there is going to be a major signal for demand, which is, like Thibault said, it's going to pull the supply. And I think we've been waiting for that, and we're starting to see that, especially around nature-based. So that's exciting.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if you look at the numbers, I read that patch report. It was quite good, but the market, like you said, is fragmented, and it's lumpy, right? In some areas, retirements have been increasing, and other areas it's been decreasing. So it's tough to get a general overview of what's happening. I don't know what's going on with Renee over there, but
I'm switching to handheld. But no, can I just chime in on that? I think it's really great to see this kind of reversion back to essentially a seller's market in pockets, right? And I think that the CDR market is certainly reflective of that, because there's been effectively a limitation of the supply that's available at spot. Everything's on the forward curve when we look at emerging methodologies like enhanced stock weathering, direct air capture, and even biochar to a certain extent. On the ARR side, there's so much greater potential for scale, just given the size of ecosystems globally. But it's hard work, as you guys said, and I think that increasingly we'll see more and more kind of coming down on the potential issuance. So it becomes harder and harder to issue more and more tons. But nonetheless, there will be supply, but right now there is a real crunch. And I think that there'll continue to be a crunch up until the 2030s. It's just maths. Even if you started planning projects at scale today, they're not going to yield the adequate supply until the 2030s, probably mid-2030s, right? It takes about 7 years to 10 years, somewhere like that, to start to yield really significant supply. And so as demand really starts to come on, and I think it'll come on like a tidal wave, we think that there'll be dislocations with regards to the pricing for these instruments. And that then really creates a perfect storm to complete these kind of metaphors, but effectively for the investors, right? It starts off with the buy side coming back in and supporting these new projects to get off the ground. And then the financiers and secondary market participants then start to emerge to try to get their pole positions as well. And that then actually gets more and more liquidity in the market. And generally, that's just a healthy sign of a healthy market.
Yeah. Definitely.
My call to action is to the secondary market folks that are not necessarily familiar with emerging standards like ERS. Put your helmets on, guys. Like, get ready, because this is going to unlock huge potential of really high integrity supply that everyone's been clamoring for. And there's going to be a very limited supply that's available on the secondary market. You need to start really thinking about, and this applies to Vera as well, just to be fully transparent. And I think it also applies to Ser Carbono and other standards, that there is a pipeline of high integrity credits coming, but that supply is not going to be felt in the market in terms of spot transactions for quite some time. So you do want to start placing bets around securing that long-term supply if you're interested in servicing your customer base.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think, like, with regards to the Microsoft offtake, obviously Microsoft, their balance sheet is massive compared to other corporates. And, I was in San Francisco Climate Week a few weeks ago, and I had the chance to speak with some folks at Microsoft and some other corporates, and they all talk about, oh, well, we're not as big as Microsoft. Oh, well, we can't have a 20, 30 person, team. And it is true that, we're seeing Microsoft put up all this risk capital to invest in these technologies and these solutions, whereas other corporates, that's not their role and they don't have the ability to put forward that risk capital similar to a venture capital firm or a big bank. And I think that's when you start to see these advanced market coalitions, like you mentioned, Symbiosis, start to play a big role in the market when these corporates come together to mitigate that risk and start to pool capital together to invest in these technologies, right? And I think on that topic of Symbiosis, I know ERS did play a role. Would love to just briefly touch on that and hear about how you guys played a role in the Symbiosis Coalition and what you think about advanced market coalitions. We're seeing a lot of coalitions emerge. Frontier, Symbiosis. We're seeing some developments in Asia, which will be coming to the market soon. Would love to hear your take and overall experience with Symbiosis.
So one, I think the Symbiosis team is second to none. I mean, you've got Julia, Paolo, Natalie, Freddie. I mean, their entire team is world class, and they're a very lean team running something incredibly ambitious and doing a tremendous job. So I think huge shout out to them for all of the work they put in. Two, more and more corporates are going to be joining these things. They'll have to in order to secure supply. It won't be a matter of if, it'll be a matter of when.
And why do you think that is? Like, they have to in order to
There is no supply. Like Renee was saying,
Yeah.
is like if you want this, like certain project categories, you already have to buy on a forward curve. And I mean, we're trying to alleviate some of this pain point through the speed and scale thing, but like it still takes time to
Certainly.
bring new supply on board. And like Renee said, like the supply takes a while to ramp up. And so there's a fundamental mismatch between emissions liabilities from corporates and the availability of projects that sequester and avoid carbon going into the atmosphere. And there always will be. Like we wouldn't, if there wasn't, we wouldn't have climate change, right? that fundamental imbalance exists, like is why we have climate change. And so long as that remains a problem of this magnitude, you will have that fundamental imbalance as so long as these markets are functioning, and they're starting to function better again. And so you're seeing the market reality reflects sort of the physical reality, which is like it's very hard to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And so if you want supply, you have to get in now. And to be fair to Microsoft too, like a lot of people say like, well, we're not Microsoft. The vast majority of Microsoft deals are offtake agreements that the contract details aren't out for a lot of them, but I suspect a lot of them are pay on delivery. And so, like, yes, you don't have their due diligence team, but like you can go to Valaterra, you can go like there's a whole host of people who can help you structure these deals where you don't have to invest off balance sheet. And there are banks and intermediaries that if you've got a signed offtake, are going to be able to put up financing capital that'll unlock huge amounts of supply. And like that's a huge piece of it. And that's why Microsoft and Symbiosis exists, is to catalyze this and say, hey, come on in. The water's fine. More people should be doing this.
Yeah, certainly. And I also think, for other corporates, it does provide a lot of support throughout the process, right? Throughout the due diligence process, and almost, a bit of, here, we're gonna hold your hand through this process and help you, secure supply, because we have this amazing team here, this amazing team here, and we're gonna come together and support you with this advanced market coalition. And that's what we've seen with Frontier on the engineered side and the tech removals. And at the end of the day, it's going to take a lot of capital to scale these technologies and bring down the costs over time, right? I mean, that's the whole reason that they're significantly priced high today. Is, for the future, we need those prices to come down. We need risk capital to be put up front. And Renee, looks like you're heading out.
I'm literally putting my hand up, but no. Just before I board, I just wanted to say one last thing, or two last things. Firstly, thank you to Thibault and Judith for joining the episode. I really enjoyed this conversation, and again, congratulations to all the hard work that you guys have been doing, and now seeing that kind of pay off. The second thing is around my observation on the advanced market commitments. I think I echo what Thibault said. I think it is the beginning of many other AMCs coming to the market. Maybe some with regional focuses or biases, and others with maybe technological sort of purposes. Great. Why do these things make sense? Because we've touched on it already. Corporates lack necessarily the technical and internal capabilities to evaluate projects at large. And so by centralizing that pool of kind of information and kind of resources together with other corporates, there's safety in numbers, and there's an efficiency that is achieved through having a centralized group like Symbiosis and others to do the process evaluation, essentially the origination component that then begets effectively an evaluation at an investment level, and then the offtakes. Then to Thibault's point around corporates should not be doing the heavy lifting on balance sheet effectively. They should be looking at offtakes purely on a delivery versus payment basis, and allow for financiers to come in and to bridge that financing gap. Comes back to what we discussed around risk, right? Folks that are capital allocators understand risk inherently. That is their day job. And now they can see that the transactions have been de-risked through having very credible counterparties on the offtake side. And they can then bridge that void. And it's not requiring of corporates to do that. Corporates are not, unless they have the corporate ventures arm, equipped to provide venture financing, right? And certainly on carbon side, they shouldn't be the ones doing that. But oftentimes, because the system has been broken, project developers are being going to the corporates to say, "Hey, will you help me finance this project so that we can achieve these outcomes?" It's putting the cart in front of the horse. This new novel approach around the OMCs will effectively put things back in order. So I think it's great. So last observation before I jump on my plane. So thanks, Eddie. Thanks to Judith.
Thanks, Renee, for joining, and have a good flight.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good flight. Bye, Renee.
Safe travels.
Thanks. I'll keep listening in until I board. But yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah, he's gonna be 1,000 feet in the air and chime in. But yeah, I think Judith, pulling you in here. Obviously you've had some significant experience in the voluntary markets. Where were these, advanced market commitments 10 years ago, or, at the earlier stages of the market? Like what do you think is the change in pace, or the change of what we're seeing with these AMCs compared to, what we've seen in the past in the market?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I don't have 10 years of experience in the market. So I got the crash course in the market when I was leading Vera. So that was only a couple of years ago. And I feel like you're touching on what I think the difference is like there's safety in numbers. Let's collect together. Let's kind of tackle these things en masse. Because the market is complicated, it's segmented, and it does require a lot of due diligence. So I think we've made it kind of hard times for buyers. And then because of the trust and transparency, issues that we faced over the last couple of years, I think it's making them more guarded, which means let's make sure we're doing the right due diligence before we jump in, because our reputation could be at risk. So I think it's the right thing to do, and it's exciting to see this positive signal and significant investments that we're seeing. But I don't know that I have more insights than that for you, Eddie.
No worries. And certainly I 100% agree. And it's great to see. But, I think closing up here, and segueing to our last part, I want to ask, two last questions for you guys. And the first one would be, what do you hope that this space, specifically nature-based solutions, and with what your role is at ERS, what do you think? What do you hope this space looks like 3 to 4 years from now? And how do you think ERS's role is helping us get there? Right. I think it's all about the future. Everything that's priced today is based on the future value. So what do you think the future looks like, and how do you think ERS is helping us get there?
Thibault, I'll let you start.
Sounds good. And I want to hear your thoughts too, Judith, because you're a big part of helping us build the future at ERS. And I think it starts with, for us, an increase in scope to conservation, but for the market as a whole, a renewed recognition that we can win the fight and still lose the fight. We can sequester all the carbon we want out of the atmosphere, but if we lose the world's standing forests, we lose the game. There is no fabric of life left on Earth, or that we will have significantly diminished it, and there are no enviable climate scenarios where we don't stop forest loss. To give everybody a quick order of magnitude, we lost 1 billion hectares, half the forest that we've lost in the last 10,000 years, we've lost in the last 100. And deforestation is still going on at a massive rate. Last year, we lost net, I think it was 47 million hectares. It's the size of a small country like Switzerland. We need to address forest loss if we're going to win the overall fight. And so we're really excited to start figuring out ways to build methodologies for forest conservation, and reducing deforestation. And I think the market as a whole needs to bring back sort of a 2.0 version of avoided deforestation projects if we're going to win this fight. I really, is a bit of a contrarian take. I think everybody right away, but I think that it's too much of a risk. We can't solve this without protecting the forest that still exist.
Yeah.
My hope is similar, which is it's the same plus this recognition of how important the ecological impact and the social impact of these projects are, and not just the carbon math. So when I think about just all the controversies and criticisms, yes, there were opportunities that we've learned from, but I think we still underestimate the impact to biodiversity and to the people who live in these forests and in these areas, and we need to value that in a new way. And I'm also hoping we'll feel like we're building momentum by then, and we're kind of getting back on track. Like we've had an awakening as a species to urgently address and make progress toward this critical mission. That's what I hope for.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's really, really well said. And I couldn't agree more on the Red Plus side. We need to avoid deforestation as much as possible. It's really unfortunate to see what's happening in some of the world's largest natural carbon sinks. And I agree 100%. So thank you guys so much for joining today. I really appreciate your time and your insights. It was really great to hear from you, and I look forward to keeping the conversation going in the future. And I look forward to everything that's going to come out of ERS. Hopefully, we'll have some collaborative things coming out soon. Hint, hint. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you
All
for the
right.
podcast, and thank you for all your work.
Yeah. And for our audience, be sure to check out this episode on YouTube. Gotta hit them with the like, subscribe, follow, smash that like button. Yeah, the typical.
Awesome. Take
and-
care.
That's
Those were-
hilarious.
Remember,
All right.
Back.
Bye.
I'm in gangs. Thanks, guys. Take care. Thank you. Appreciate it.